you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Every year, the parents of Jesus used to go to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up for the feast as usual. When they were on their way home after the feast, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem without his parents knowing it. They assumed he was with the caravan, and it was only after a day's journey that they went to look for him among their relations and acquaintances. When they failed to find him, they went back to Jerusalem looking for him everywhere. 3 days later, they found him in the temple, sitting among the doctors, listening to them and asking them questions. And all those who heard him were astounded at his intelligence and his replies. They were overcome when they saw him, and his mother said to him, "My child, why have you done this to us? See how worried your father and I have been looking for you." "Why were you looking for me?" he replied. "Did you not know I must be busy with my father's affairs?" But they did not understand what he meant. He then went down with them and came to Nazareth and lived under their authority. His mother stored up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and men. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
I don't know if there's any family here that can say they are free from, as we say in Trinidad, drama. Anybody? That's the reality of life, the ups and downs. And yet somewhere in all of that, God is at work and God is present. If we remember, some weeks ago, the 17th of December, the gospel reading that we had was the beginning of Matthew's gospel, the genealogy of Jesus, in other words, his family tree. And in there you saw liars and people who were deceitful, and you saw murderers and adulterers. You saw all sorts of things. Part of the dramas of family life. But yet, Christmas is about family, because within all of that, God chooses to be born. God chooses to come to us through the family, and through a special family, which we call the Holy Family: Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. The question then that we have to ask ourselves is this: is the Holy Family an exception because it's so high and beyond us, or is it a model? Or is it a model for us? And quite often people think of it as an exception because, they think, well, there you have Mary, who was conceived without sin. And you have Jesus. And there's an old joke that says, so therefore they always blame Joseph for anything that went wrong. But the truth is that within Jesus' own lineage, we recognize the ways in which, yes, there are many dramas to family life, but God chooses to be at work in all of this. The other thing we have to recognize is that each one of us belongs to a family. The person next to you is somebody's son or daughter or mother or father or something. That when we see each other, we often think of an individual, but they're persons. Persons coming from a family, and they represent a family. And therefore we have to remember this as we relate to each other. As we care for each other, we care for each other's families. And this corporate sense of caring is much more pronounced in Israelite society. So, is it possible for our families to be holy? How? And why is this important for the church and for society? I wish to begin by answering the last one, and I want to quote from Pope Francis, who tells us that the welfare of the family, and this is in his writings, his post-apostolic exhortation, the joy of love, that the welfare of the family is important, is decisive for the future of the world and of the church. And why? Because he would speak about it as a fundamental cell of society. And many Catholic sociologists have expounded this. Family is a relational good. In other words, the family generates what we call social capital. It tightens the bonds within society. As you have marriages and families that grow and strengthen, they offer to the community and to the world more and more relations that are integrated, that help to build up the society. And therefore, in the face of the threat that there is to marriage and family life today, the fundamental truth is that the family is foundational. It is the first natural society. And that exists outside of religion. Because every philosopher would tell you that. It is a first natural society. Therefore, we must care for our families. That's why it's important. Also, this is not only so for societies, for the church. How else, in the baptismal rite and in the wedding rite, there are aspects of that rite that speak about the way in which the gift of children is a way in which the faith is spread, carried on. The family, the domestic church, becomes a place in which the faith is taught. First, of course, by the way we live. As we say, faith is caught before it's taught. By the way we live. And that's one of the reasons why family life is in crisis. Because quite often we live in our world today by do as I say and not as I do. So it's important for the church. And Pope Francis also reminds us that the church is a family of families. If we think of each person gathered here, the church is a family of families gathering. Important for us to remember. We also remember what Pope John Paul II taught us and reveals to us or brings out in the scriptures in a very powerful way in his theology of the body, that in the family what we see is the image of God. That's what God says in Genesis. In the image of God he made them, male and female he created them. That this image of God is, yes, in the individual person, but even more so in the family. Male and female he created them. There, within this family unit, you see the image of God, who is the communion of persons. If you listen carefully to the opening prayer, it says, O God, who were pleased, plural, that God is this communion of persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. The importance of marriage and family life today. And yet, it's under threat. It's under threat. And part of this is the reality, yes, of our brokenness, as we have shared. Brokenness in the midst of, well, there's a lot of war and strife. We have refugee families under threat worldwide, and the movement of families all over the world, refugees. In our own nation, we recognize that. In our own families, we recognize aspects of addiction, grief, abuse. People fight in Trinidad over land settlements. The challenge of technology to families, of sexual identity and the gender, what is going on in gender and all these things. So there's more and more greater confusion around marriage and family life. But Pope Francis reminds us that if we're willing to defend, as we do today, more and more, the environment and everything to do with animals and the trees and the earth, why are we not willing to defend what is most natural to us? Family life. Family life. Man and woman brought together to bring forth life. And the family we're not speaking here about here is not a nuclear family in the way in which it is understood, because from the time you use that, you fall into a trap in modern society, in a sociological trap. They think of it as a bourgeois family, which is a Marxist reading. But it's a family that is a natural family. The natural family that if we were to just look and see, there you see it. There's a Catholic philosopher who says, how wonderful are all these colors in the world, and how easy it is for us to see them when it comes to marriage and family. And he says, but our world today tells us, don't see properly. Throw some dust in your eyes, because it's dangerous to see properly and to see the beauty of the natural family. The family that God has given to us. And a large part of this, yes, is a threat of individualism. This threat. And the irony of that, of course, is that to have flourishing individuals in the world, they must have come from good families. They must have come from good families. How then is it possible to be holy in our families? And our readings invite us to really reflect on this. Our first reading is from the book of Samuel, and a wonderful reading because the book of Samuel is situated at a place in the New Testament where Israel is in crisis. They're in a major crisis. And as the book of Samuel begins to tackle this crisis, it does not begin with the corporate society of Israel. It begins with a family, Hannah, who is barren and she herself is experiencing crisis. So therefore, Samuel introduces us in this book, the book of Samuel, introduces us to the way in which, as we look at Hannah and what is happening to the family, you have this metaphor, as it were, for the whole of society. And that's why Pope John Paul and Pope Francis speak about as the family goes, so goes the society. So Hannah is barren, Israel is barren. Hannah is in crisis, because to be barren in that time, you were in crisis. And what does she do? She trusts in God. She recognizes there's nothing that I can do to fix the situation. That it's out of God's goodness and His mercy and love for me that something will happen. Just as Israel must come to learn that, and who brings that message to Israel is Hannah's child, Samuel. Samuel becomes this prophet that leads Israel through this crisis towards the establishment of a line of kings, and therefore the establishment of the Davidic kingdom, out of which comes Jesus Christ. But it's important to recognize the way in which God works in our world, beginning in our families. Beginning in our families. And that's important for us to learn deep inside. So therefore, part of a family being holy is recognizing our need for God. We can't fix it all. Pope Francis, in his writings on Rejoice and Be Glad, on holiness, speaks about the threat in which the way in which we think we can all do it by our own strength. A rehashing of an old-time heresy. But no, we need God. And then Hannah is open to be used by God. And therefore part of being holy in our families is an openness to be used by God there. More and more, we find it easy to live religion and our faith everywhere else, and sometimes except in our families. We find it easy to love everybody else except in our families. But if we are open to the transformation and conversion that God really wants to do in us, it begins in our families. It begins right there. And it's a lot of dying to self. Pope Francis tells us the strength of the family lies in its capacity to love and to teach how to love. For all the family's problems, it can grow, beginning with love. What we need has already been given to us in Jesus Christ. Love. Love. And the example of love that is complete on the cross is self-dying within our families that allows life to come forth. Love. We see the example of Hannah as well being generous. Lord, what you give to me, I will give back to you. In offering of a child to God. And so Samuel grows in the ways of the Lord. And each family is called to be the domestic church, where God desires to work, where grace flows through their marriage. And God is at work in our world. Now, there are many parallels between Hannah and Mary, if you read it carefully. Hannah actually is the feminine form of the Hebrew word for grace, hen. And Mary becomes the one who is full of grace. And there are many parallels between Jesus and Samuel that we can see. But this openness to God that Hannah reminds us is an openness that must happen even at the level of our sexuality. Hannah brings us forth in our readings today, and Mary. That is not just an openness to caring for the poor or doing our due. In one sense, that is still exterior. God wants an openness from us that is in every single part of our lives, in our marriages, in our relationships, in our sexuality, and in our understanding of ourselves, that allows His word to take root and allows Him to grow in us and do something new in us. And Hannah shows us that example. And that, when we begin there being open to God, then everything else is open to His way. And there's a lot we can go into with that. But that's one of the areas where we have become more and more close to God and God's way. Because of the desire and the foolish lie that there is in thinking that the way to go is unbridled freedom. I should be able to do what I want, when I want, how I want. Not realizing that we are dependent on each other. And what I do, what you do, affects the other. In the gospel, we have a very human story as well. Jesus is on his way with his parents. They go to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, and on their way back, they can't find him. Oh, another thing about the holiness of family there, that the family prays together. Hannah and her family were on their way to Shiloh, where the temple was. Jesus and his family, they're on their way to Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem. And so, in this journey, they are praying together. Our Sunday worship is essential for us coming to church as families. So they're on their way back, and Mary and Joseph realize, well, where is Jesus? Where is Jesus? Did we lose the Son of God? Where is he? So they must have been in, tremendous crisis. But they begin to search. They begin to search, and where is he? Now, in this, they realize that when they encounter him, his answer is so strange. He's doing his Father's will. He's doing his Father's will. And with time, as Mary pondered these things, and Joseph no doubt, they begin to realize that part of caring for Jesus was also caring for this relationship that he had with his Father. Caring for that too. That his identity is both human and divine. And therefore, holiness in family is caring for this relationship that each of us has with God the Father and our children, bringing them up in the faith, allowing them to know their true identity is in God, not in the things they have, or what people think of them, or how many likes they have on some social media, but in who they are as children of God. They journey together. They journey together, and they search out. And what they come to realize ultimately then is that doing God's work is what is primary and most important. And therefore, the gospel is not a story about rebellion, but about obedience and identity, as should our family lives be. Obedience and identity. But that can only come out of love. And our families, therefore, if they're holy, must be schools of love. The family, therefore, must walk together in the midst of its lights and shadows. The family must, Pope Francis in 2008, when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, had said that we're not going back to some nostalgic idea that we had. In fact, he says, the pastoral conversion of our communities requires moving from a pastoral ministry of mere conservation to a decidedly missionary pastoral ministry, making the church visibly present as a mother reaching out to families, as he says in Amoris Laetitia. Welcoming home, a merciful mother. Are we capable of walking with each other as Mary and Joseph walked with Jesus? Are we capable of recognizing that, yes, in journeying with families and caring for families, we have to get our shoes dirty? That, yes, there is messy work. But in the midst of that mess, God is born. That's the Christmas message. And therefore, the Holy Family is not about sanitized religion. There is pain and suffering. But God, being born in the midst of it, brings meaning to it, transforms it, and brings life out of it. The real challenge is to remember that God has not set us up to fail. His grace is sufficient. God has not set us up to fail. And therefore, yes, trusting in His grace, we move forward in our family lives. I want to end with this quote of Pope Francis that he uses at the end of the whole of Amoris Laetitia, the Joy of Love, that he wrote on love and family. All of us are called to keep striving forward towards something greater than ourselves and our families. Every family must feel this constant impulse. Let us make this journey as families. Let us keep walking together, because what we have been promised is greater than we can imagine. May we never lose heart because of our limitations, or stop seeking the fullness of love and communion which God holds out before us. He has not set us up to fail. Amen.